Derek Thompson is a staff writer at The Atlantic and the host of the podcast Plain English. He's the author of the national bestseller Hitmakers and On Work, an anthology of his writing on labor and technology. He lives in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And Clayton Page Aldern is a senior data reporter at GRIST, as well as a research affiliate at the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology at the University of Washington. Aldern is the co-author of Homelessness is a Housing Problem and author of The Weight of Nature. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Clayton Aldern and Derek Thompson.
Hey, everyone. You made it out on, is this a Monday night, beginning of the week? We're so grateful to have Derek here. Your book has incited a storm on the internet, on both sides of the political aisle. How have you done it?
Ezra calls it a discourse-generating machine. I want to be careful about not plagiarizing my co-author, but yeah, discourse-generating machine is what we settled on.
And speaking of, neologisms, this notion of abundance, we also have a handful of other phrases that are skillfully bandied about over the course of this text. Just a very quick show of hands, who here has read the book?
Pretty good.
Okay.
Pretty good. Better than Twitter, for sure.
So that was kind of
share of people commenting on the book. Yeah.
That was, I think, the minority of hands in the crowd. So just why don't we start with the basics? What the heck is abundance? What is supply side progressivism? What is state capacity? Why do we care about these things? Elevator pitch me.
Sure. Let me. I'll broken elevator pitch you. Imagine we're in the elevator and I want to give you the 15-second pitch, but the elevator breaks down for exactly 2.5 minutes.
We have a lot of those here.
And so yeah,
all the escalators at the light rail stations.
Okay, this is a light rail station escalator pitch. Thank you for setting that up. So the story of this book is that I was working on an entirely different book project about, first let me start. Seattle, it's so wonderful to be here. This is so great to have a sellout crowd. This is really, really fun. Thank you for coming out. So I was working on this entirely different and utterly doomed project about the nature of scientific progress, just some pathetically unwieldy idea. And I took a book leave in the middle of the summer of 2021, which I described to my wife as one of the most miserable writing experiences of my life, because when you're working on a book that is a failure, you know it sentence to sentence, it really, really sucks to have to sort of death march your way through it. So I come back to The Atlantic, and I'm just so excited to be back in the world of writing weekly again. And I'm thinking about ways to match my writing about progress to what I'm seeing happening in politics. And this dang Ezra Klein just freaking nails it with this essay in the New York Times in the fall of 2021, in this article that he calls The Economic Mistake the Left is Finally Confronting. And he says in this really wonderful essay that for many decades, the left in America has been rightly focused on the demand side of the ledger, taxing and spending, and using spending to reduce poverty and increase human welfare, earned income tax credit, child tax credit, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And these are worthy programs. But that in the last 50 years, liberals had gotten out of the habit of paying attention to the supply side of the economy. And what was unfortunate is that supply side, like the word deregulation, is often coded as conservative. And even to talk about the supply side or talk about the idea that a rule might be bad seems like you're siding with the neolibs. And he said we need, as liberals, to remember that if we want housing to be abundant, we need to build it. If we want clean energy to be abundant, we have to make it easier to be built. So we need to not only be demand-side progressives, but also supply-side progressives. And I read this essay and was overcome with that sickly feeling of horrible jealousy that he had really nailed something beautiful. And then a few months later, I was in Washington, D.C., where I was living, standing in line for a COVID test which were being rationed out of the local library, freezing my little butt off and thinking, God, like, how is it that 2 years into a pandemic now, January of 2022, we still are rationing COVID tests? Just as we had to ration the COVID vaccines, just as we didn't have enough PPE, just as we didn't have enough masks. And as I was thinking about this idea that shortages had been a theme of the COVID economy, I thought, well, if you scope out, shortage and scarcity has been a theme of the entire 21st century economy. I mean, look at housing in the places that have the highest demand for housing. Look at clean energy, which we're clearly not building enough of. Look at the fact that one of the reasons why America is less healthy than similarly rich nations, and also that healthcare is so expensive, is that we, through a variety of ways, limit the number of doctors that can be created through the residency program. It just kind of seemed like we have a scarcity economy within a scarcity century. And just because I'm sort of like a binary thinker, a little simpleton, I was like, what's the, Google, what's the antonym of scarcity? Abundance. And I thought, abundance is this huge, capacious, almost unwieldy term. I need to sort of anchor it with something that sounds heavy and even like a little medicinal and like vegetal. What about agenda? That seems like a really nice, heavy term. And so I called this essay The Abundance Agenda. And Ezra read that, and he reached out and said, maybe we should write this book together because it sounds like we're sort of co-writing a book along parallel tracks, and maybe it'll be less work if we work along the same track. And so I said yes, and we got book married, and then we wrote this book together. And abundance to me it's important, and we say this in the open. It's not a kind of aimless, unwieldy abundance of all things. We don't believe in an abundance of certain kinds of flat-screen televisions. We believe, I think, as we say in the opening chapter, in not an abundance of things that fill out a home, but an abundance of things that fill out a life. Like, what is most important for human progress? What's most important for living, for the good modern life? It's medicine that keeps you alive, it's technology that gives us agency, it's housing that gives us a place to live, and it's energy that runs the economy. And so the book is very, very focused on abundance in those categories as they go chronologically in the book: housing, then energy, science, technology. And because we are liberals, because we're progressives, we believe in a muscular government to oversee much of these policies to make sure that the ends are liberal, that the ends are right. And so we have this word that we borrowed from some of our friends, and I think it sort of came from the Libertarian Center, state capacity, which basically means, can the government do what it says it wants to do? When it says, for example, that it wants to build high-speed rail in California, does it build high-speed rail in California? Spoiler alert, it does not. It does not. And so much of the book is a very deep critique of the failure of liberal governance to achieve liberal ends. Because quite frankly, at a time when it's so important, I think, to have an opposition that is popular and effective, we instead have a Democratic Party right now that's very unpopular, 29% approval rating according to CNN, and frankly quite ineffective in many of the places that it holds the most power. And we should be interested as liberals in turning the places that we govern into advertisements of our cause rather than advertisements for the opposition. And I'll just close by quoting a line that Ezra wrote, which I was, again, very jealous of, where he said, people in California should be able to say, liberals in California should be able to say, vote for us and we'll make America like California. And instead, Republicans seem to find a lot of advantage in saying, vote for them and they'll make America like California. And you don't want that to be your movement. You don't want your movement to be marked by the fact that wherever it wins the most power, it has extraordinary levels of dysfunction. And so a great deal of this book is about bringing function back to liberalism.
So, a lot of what you just... Oh. Sold. And we're done. I had to basically sign an affidavit that said I wouldn't be too much of a socialist up here. So I will ask this next question very carefully. In thinking about friends in perhaps the libertarian right, and the manners in which the abundance agenda, though I know that we're careful to distinguish between a lens here versus an actual set of policy prescriptions. To what extent does this lens seek to think about something like carrying capacity, right? If we're interested in, for example, growth, if we're interested in technological innovation, how do these questions square against the fact that we do seem to have a fixed carrying capacity on this earth, and that inevitably infinite growth may not be compatible with a fixed carrying capacity?
Yeah, well, that question is an intense legal violation of the contract that we signed before. No. I'm not as convinced that we have a carrying capacity. What I am convinced of is a few things. One, in the 1960s, 1970s, there were a lot of people who extrapolated mid-century fertility rates and projected that the global population in the 2020s, 2030s would be reaching 10, 15 billion people. And instead, what transpired over the last 50 years is the absolute global objective collapse in fertility rates in practically every country. And so a lot of the fears that the earth cannot bear our lives have, for better or worse, been complicated by the fact that the predictions which relied on certain fertility rates were disproved by the fertility rates that actually exist. And we can already see that many countries, including China, are likely to begin to decline in population in just the next 10 years. So that's one reason why I'm less convinced by the argument that we're headed toward a world that cannot bear a modern life. The second, which might be more important, deals with technology. If we had never invented nuclear power, or solar power, or wind power, or geothermal technology, if the only way to cool a room, or heat a room, or turn the lights on, or run a factory was to dig things out of the earth and burn them, then you might be right that we're sort of well and truly effed, because there's simply no way to have a modern life that doesn't require burning stuff in the ground and releasing carbon dioxide into the air. But what's happened instead over the last 70 years is that we invented nuclear power, and we invented solar power, and we developed and made, by an order of magnitude, more efficient wind power, and we're still working on geothermal energy, and we're working on modular nuclear, and we're also working on fusion, which is, arriving sometime between 1 week and 100 years from now. And technology makes possible what was previously impossible, which is the ability to think about a future where people live rich, modern lives, not just in this country, but around the world, in a way that's more sustainable. It's going to be very hard. It's going to require more technological breakthroughs. It might require breakthroughs in technologies I didn't even mention, like carbon capture and removal at scale, which right now is something that does not work at anything like the price that it has to work at. But we've seen throughout American history that government has been successful at pulling forward technologies that otherwise wouldn't exist. In the 1940s, penicillin was a failed experiment in the UK. For 13 years after Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin by accident in his lab in Scotland, penicillin did nothing for the human race. First 13 years of penicillin's existence, it had been tried out on 5 people. 2 of them died. If you had stopped the clock of penicillin at 1942 and said, is this drug worth anything? You'd say no. In phase 2 clinical trials, it killed 40% of the population. Instead, in World War II, the Office of Scientific Research and Development in the United States took penicillin and scaled its production, grew enormous vats of it, learned how to make its manufacture cheap, tested it, confirmed that it was successful against various bacteria, sent it all over the world, and brought down the fatality rate of bacterial infections in British and American soldiers by a factor of 18. So that's a world in which federal policy accelerated scientific discovery. We saw in a weird way the exact same thing with Operation Warp Speed, where Operation Warp Speed is such a fascinating program because Democrats don't talk about it very much, as it was a Trump program. You'd think that Trump would be incredibly proud of it, except that his entire base now is rabidly anti-vax, so weirdly he's been negatively polarized against objectively the most successful thing he's ever done. I mean, just unbelievably, imagine if the people in charge of the space program just found that their electoral base just hated the moon, and so they just had to run away from having ever gotten there. Operation Warp Speed took the land speed record for developing a vaccine from 10 years to 10 months. It was an extraordinary scientific and technological achievement, and it shows what a kind of focused government invention agenda can do. And so I don't want to go too deep into the science aspects of it because I think we might return to it, but I'm optimistic about the idea that a purposeful government that has strategy, that is outcome-focused, really can make technologies that are important to the world be developed faster. We've done it before. We did it with penicillin. We did it with nuclear power. We did it with mRNA vaccines. I hope and I pray that we can do the same with technologies like carbon removal.
And if we can't, which is not to suggest can't at some future point, but can't in, say, the near to medium term, I fear that we may be left with an objection that I see you two raise in this book to something like degrowth, which effectively says along these pages, we can't pursue an agenda like that one simply because it may take too long. Imagine the political coalition that you'd need to put together, the revolutionary political coalition you'd need to put together in order to implement something like degrowth. If you believe that was
just say a little bit about how you're defining degrowth, because I don't want to define it for you.
Yeah, right. So in thinking about an economy that, in the words of somebody like Kohei Saito, right, degrowth communism, to use some very scary words, looks slightly different from our own in that we are not motivated by a profit motive per se. Instead, and interestingly, he uses an abundance lexicon as well. We're motivated by an abundance motive, such that we want to ensure that folks are working less, right? Abundant in what we need, and need is defined as a function of the activities of daily life, right? So folks are working less. Folks are probably thinking about co-ops, right? Worker cooperatives. The extent to which we have seen successes around the world in small factions. Degrowth communism under somebody like Saito, is effectively a scaling up thereof, right? And without a profit motive, you're effectively arguing for a different metric. So it has less to do with slowing an economy per se, and more to do, again, with something like redistribution. Thinking about what are the outcomes that we're measuring, and are those outcomes somehow related to abundance in the personal sense, as opposed to, the global prosperity sense. So under something like this framework, you can arm wrestle with a whole lot of people, and you end up in a position where you have to put together quite a large coalition, because inevitably you are talking about regulating some industries, and regulating some industries quite seriously, right? You're probably taking something like municipal water, indeed, under municipal control as opposed to private control. You're saying, well, fossil fuels, we don't like them so much. We, a state, don't like them so much. And so there's some top-down element there that requires political organizing. And what I read in the book is, okay, this type of organizing, the kind of Jason Hickel type of organizing, is really, really onerous, and it's far future. And so I'm curious when we talk about something like fusion. If we bank on technologies of the future in order to improve lives of people in the near and medium term, what happens if we don't get there? And I fear, that this is something of a pigeonholing question, right? Because it's got a predetermined conclusion here. But can you see what I'm getting at with the time horizons here? And in part, this is, I think, a question about the discount rate, right? How do we properly value the present? How do we think about the risk of technological development? What is the appropriate amount of risk to place on something that is ultimately unknown?
My feeling about degrowth, let me summarize the question this way. If what we care about fundamentally is that, if what we value more than anything else is the planet and the biosphere, and we're going to orient all of our policies around minimizing the degree to which human activity leaves a mark on the atmosphere and the share of carbon in the atmosphere. The problem with a strategy that puts the planet over people is that the planet doesn't vote, and people do, and they vote a lot. They vote every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 years. And my fear is that a political coalition that is planted over people will win power, if it's lucky, and then lose immediately, and then lose forever. If you look at what's happening in, say, Germany, right? Germany pulled back from coal, pulled back from natural gas, even pulled back from nuclear, and said, we're going to try to do our best to make this entire economy renewables. There's a way in which I deeply respect that strategy. Like, that is a strategy that is entirely in keeping with a care for the planet that I have. And then energy prices tripled, and the governing party suffered its largest electoral loss, not in 20 years, but in 200 years. You can't have, as a political strategy for any movement, a plan to lose by the largest margin in 200 years every 2 years. You're just going to lose power the second you gain it. People want growth, and people vote. And it's not just Americans who want growth, and not just Germans who want growth. It's people in Africa, it's people in Bangladesh, it's people in India, it's people in China. It's people throughout the world that right now, in many cases, don't have access to anything like a third of the amount of electricity that we use. And they're going to come online to the global economy, and they're going to start using coal and gas and oil. And if we're really going to care about planetary solutions to a planetary problem, I do think we have to think technologically for the world and also practically for home. And my fear about degrowth is, even though there are ways in which I sympathize with many of their ends, in order to get to those ends, you have to win so many fights against a party that's going to say, we're for just shutting down all the solar and all the wind. That's what's happening right now with the Trump administration. They're shutting down oil and solar and wind. They're shutting down everything that even smacks of the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm worried that it's a plan to lose. And if your politics is likely a plan to lose, it's not a politics, it's simply a philosophy. It's simply a beautiful thing to think about that has no actual ability to win power. So one thing that we're trying to do in this book, and I think you're really smart to see it, is provide a synthesis between the ends of environmentalism and the means of democracy. And what we're saying is clean energy abundance, finding ways to make it as easy as possible to add energy to the grid that doesn't release carbon dioxide into the air, and even, with some technologies, slurps carbon dioxide out of the air. Finding a way to make it easier to build these technologies is the only path forward that allows us to maintain power. Because when you lose power as a party, even if it's degrowth communism, that cares about things that are bigger than the planet, that care about universal health care, care about not deporting American citizens or people on green cards, care about not violating principles of free speech and turning the American universities into an extension of the executive state. If you lose power over the issue of putting the planet over people, you also lose the ability to protect people's health care and protect deportations and protect universities and protect science. You lose your ability to govern all of it. And so that's why we're interested in a synthesis between the ends of environmentalism, which is a planetary care, and a means of growth that we think will work to not only build the clean energy of the future, but also do so in a way that allows us to win election after election after election.
So let's talk about people, right? So we had this notion of a backlash in Germany, for example, right? And the Gilets jaunes in France, right? This notion that if there's some kind of bottleneck with respect to energy, people are going to get angry. And of course, there's going to be room for people in a democratic society to express that anger. One could argue that NIMBYism, for example, is an expression of similar forms of bottled anger. And we have modes in democratic societies for people expressing their preferences. And indeed, in something like an administrative state, perhaps the liberal state in which we live, those preferences, whether at the neighborhood level or otherwise, getting in the way of something like abundance. So I'm curious how you envision something like abundance squaring with democratic outcomes, people's voices being heard. One could argue that If a neighborhood association is able to block a housing development, well, that's actually a democratic outcome at the local level. Are they right? Are they wrong?
Yeah, this is a wonderful issue. So like on the issue of housing, I'm very interested in thinking about housing through like a democratic lens. I think that a lot of people associate like the most local level with the deepest level of democracy. They think the more local the election, the more democratic it truly is. There's of course truth to that in that we have exquisite amounts of control over the neighborhoods that we live in. But there's also a sense in that to the extent that democracy is the ability to bring the most people into a decision-making process, local elections that have only, say, 15, 20% of the electorate voting are, in a weird way, sometimes less of an expression of true democratic will than an election that brings out 60, 70% of voters. And the reason that matters for housing is something like this. I think there are a lot of rooms, city council meetings, where mayors will be with their city council debating a new development. And the development will be up for debate. And they'll bring in, people will file in, say 50 people in the room will come up to the mic and say whether or not they agree with the development that's being voted on. And from my experience talking to mayors, 90%, 95% of the people that walk up to that mic are against the development. The people who are in that room, they tend to be older, they tend to be richer, they tend to own homes. So they tend to be acting on their loss aversion, which is human instinct, it's human psychology. You're not going to fight human psychology, I understand that. But what ends up happening is that the mayors and the city council at the front of that room are hearing objection after objection after objection from the richer homeowner NIMBYs in their community, and so they end up voting no against the development. And I'll talk to these people about that experience. I'll say, you're pro-housing. You're a housing abundance liberal. Why did you vote no? And they'll say, you don't understand. These are my constituents. These are my voters. I can't hear 90% of a room tell me no, 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 and then vote yes. And I said, I understand that. At a human level, I understand that. But for every one person in that room who holds up a lonely hand and says, I'm for this housing development, there's 10,000 people who you represent that aren't in that room. And you've been endowed with political power to vote for what you think is right. Of course you want to win elections, I understand that, but you've been endowed with political power to vote on what you think is right for your community, for the entire city. Not for the share of the city that happened on one Tuesday in March to show up at that local meeting. And I felt like it's almost as if you're allowing yourself, you're running to win a democratic election, and then allowing the actual execution of power to flow through these moments of vetocracy, these little tiny votes that happen on Tuesday after Tuesday after Tuesday, in a way that it's almost as if you never won power at all. You're simply allowing the people who happen to show up in that room to govern the city. And this is why I think so many cities across the country have, in essence, become governed by the minority of NIMBYs who happen to show up in these rooms. It's government by room, or democracy by room. I don't have the formula to fix this. Of course you should organize and bring more YIMBYs into the room. Of course you should find a way to elevate the interests of the community. But also at some level, and this is the hardest thing to get over to a politician, but I also think it's really important, at some level you just need courage. Couldn't you make so much more money if you just worked in the private sector? Why are you doing this in the first place? If not to execute power. And that's power. Like, not having power, being denuded of power, is looking out into a room of 50 people saying, nah, and being like, oh, okay, nah, and just being a seismograph for public opinion, just like, whatever you want. Actual power means being imbued with the vote of your city to act over the next 2, 6, 7, whatever years to do what you think is right for the city, and then have the courage to make that argument in town hall after town hall, on Instagram, on TikTok, wherever you want to find the kids. Find them, make the argument, and don't be embarrassed to say, yeah, I overruled the room. Because Durham's not a room, Seattle's not a room, San Francisco's not a room, it's a city. I'm the mayor of the city, And so I am voting on behalf of the city and not voting on behalf of whatever room I happen to be in.
Yeah, cheers. We hear a lot in the book, in both kind of an explicit and implicit manner about, I think, one of the distinctions you're raising here between rules and choices, right? Indeed, the ability to exercise power, to choose. And you have this example about Shapiro, for example, in Pennsylvania, being able to rebuild a bridge very, very quickly. And the manner in which he does so is by effectively declaring an emergency, unlocking the ability to choose, and as opposed to putting out a bid for contracts, being able to pick winners. So in this world of choice, we still see an example here of a recreation, and this is a Malcolm Harris critique, for example. We see a recreation of an older order, right? The bridge goes down and the bridge goes back up. We could be choosing in moments of crisis to rebuild in a different way. And I'm curious what Abundance has to say about these moments of choice. When we're faced with opportunities, how bold do we go? How bold is the utopian vision? Is it a vision that says we need to ensure sufficientarian approaches, make sure that everybody has enough, or are we going to take opportunities, use choice as opposed to rule, to dream even bigger?
The way I would put it is that I think crises are focusing mechanisms. But I also think it's up to us to determine what counts as a crisis. And so it's up to us to determine when to apply extraordinary focus. So to fill that out with a story, you began to tell it. Several years ago, tankers spilled over. There was a huge fire, burned down a bridge in I-95 in Pennsylvania. It was a huge disaster. I think 600,000 cars go to and fro over that bridge in any given day. So it would have totally cut off a major artery for East Coast traffic. Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania could have gone through the regular steps. He could have allowed environmental review. He could have had open bids. He could have gone through the permitting process. Instead, he declared a state of emergency, cut out the environmental review, just pointed to two different contractor firms, like, hey, you over there, build this bridge, entirely built with union labor. And rather than the bridge being built in 12 to 24 months, which would have been the typical timeline, it was built in 12 days. And this has been held up as a really, really clear example of state capacity, a very, very clear example of a leader identifying an obvious crisis, bridge go down, in order to accelerate an obvious solution, bridge go up, right? The reason I say crises are a focusing mechanism, but it's up to us to determine what's a crisis, is that sometimes I think there are broken bridges and fallen bridges that we just live with, that we don't consider crises. And so we just consider that business as usual is what should go on. California's housing market is a fallen bridge. It's just a fallen bridge that no one wants to call a fallen bridge at the state level. Us too. And Seattle. San Francisco, yes, Washington, D.C., Boston, put it on the list. Basically, this entire tour is just going from one friggin' fallen bridge to another. And so in California, Weiner and Wicks, two of the more pro-YIMBY state senators, just introduced this huge tranche of legislation that creates huge exclusions to CEQA, which is their environmental review process, especially for building in downtown areas, especially near transit, expedites permitting processes for clean energy, and also has new ways of backfilling scientific research given all of the destruction that's happening at the NIH. This is an emergency legislation. This is saying California law may no longer apply to dense urban home construction. That's a Josh Shapiro response. This is an emergency, and so we are waiving the law as it exists. I think it's really important, for other leaders, not just the most YIMBY state senators of California, but leaders everywhere, to recognize that we are where we are not because the system failed, but because the system worked. The purpose of a system is what it does. The outcome of a system is downstream of its processes and its habits. You are where you are because of a system that worked. And so if Seattle's housing situation is the result of a situation that worked, you should fix it. You should declare the bridge has fallen. And you need to find ways to work around the systems that you've built. Maybe it's land use policies. Maybe it's exclusions for environmental review. Maybe it's reviews on permitting. Maybe it's money from payroll taxes for development fund for social housing. There's a lot of different ways to make this work, to build back the bridge. But one job I think our book has done, like in the discourse, is give some people a language of crisis. Give people a way to say, all right, something's broken here. Why is it that in every city and almost every state where liberals have the most power, there's a housing crisis? Is it coincidence? Maybe. Is it us? Maybe. In the state of California, every single time a city gains 10% vote share of progressives, the number of housing permits declines by 30%. Something's gone wrong internally, and we need to declare an emergency. And that's so much of what this project is about.
You used the phrase land use just now, and it seems to me that much of what we're talking about is land use. Housing often is a function of land use. Citing energy, right? With the energy agenda that here requires conversations about land use. Semiconductor plants, that's often a land use question as well. Is there more to abundance than land use?
Yeah, there's a whole second half of the book about science and technology, but I will say that, yeah, there's absolutely, if someone wanted to summarize the book as being like, this is a book about land use and science grants, I'd be like, that is a punchy summary, a punchy, wonky summary of the focus of the book. There's an enormous amount about land use, because land use is how we make rules about what can be built in the physical world. And something very, very significant has happened to our relationship with the physical world. It happened around the 1960s, and it happened everywhere. It's not just Seattle that had a rash of land use policies and zoning laws and permitting changes that happened around the 1960s, 1970s. It's everywhere. And the story that we tell in the book in several different places, but I think it can be sort of unified into this sort of narrative, is in many ways I think of it as a story of environmentalism. The OG environmentalism in America, as I see it, is the rise of the sort of conservation movement in the progressive era in the early 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt getting really into Yosemite because John Muir gave him a really sweet tour, saying, you know what, I'm going to draw circles on a map, and inside those circles will be Yosemite or Yellowstone, and business cannot enter. And that was a fine step forward at the time. But what ended up happening over the next 50 years is that the rest of America got completely destroyed by industrial progress. The air was disgusting, the water was disgusting, the ground was disgusting. We lived in a truly ugly and disgusting country that it's very difficult to imagine now. I mean, just two quick anecdotes. 1943, the residents of Los Angeles woke up to smog that was so thick they thought the Japanese had launched a chemical attack. And even until the 1980s, smog was just a part of Los Angeles life. Now people in Los Angeles breathe much cleaner. It's because of the Clean Air Act. In New York City in the 1940s, the poet Dylan Thomas, one of my favorite poets, died of a respiratory disease the same month that 24 other people in Manhattan died of pollution. Imagine if every month in Manhattan, just 30 people were dying of pollution, and it wasn't even like front page news. It was like, that's life in Manhattan, just 30, someone dying every day of pollution. It was truly, truly heinous. And so we passed a set of environmental rules, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and we also changed our legal relationship with the planet. We made it much easier through a series of legal changes for neighbors or really any individual to sue the state or sue a business to stop them from building. And so what happened is that in many ways, the environmental movement of the 1960s succeeded by stopping the advance of industry, by stopping pollution that was destroying the planet. But what Ezra and I think is that right now in the 2020s, we face a different challenge. Like climate change globalizes many of the problems that in the 1960s we were fighting at a local level. And in order to solve these problems, to build more densely, which is very good for the planet, to add clean air, to add clean energy like solar and wind, it requires us to actually make changes to the physical environment. It requires us to build. And this movement that's gotten so good at the politics of blocking has lost its muscle memory for the politics of building. And so we're trying to do a little bit of a synthesis to say, we don't want to go back to the 1930s, 1940s. We don't want Dylan Thomas, the best poets, dying of pollution every single day in Manhattan. But we also don't want a world where it's so difficult to build housing in San Francisco and Portland and Seattle that working class families are leaving by the droves, not only voting against Democrats at the polls, but voting against Democrats with their feet and essentially announcing to the country that places that liberals run are not meeting the expectations of the very working class they purport to represent. And so I do think that, yes, there is a lot about land use here. And there's a lot about land use because land use policy is how we make peace with the fact that we are corporeal beings that live in a physical environment. We need to live in houses. We need to turn on our electricity and heat ourselves with energy that's actually permitted and sited somewhere. We need to build in the physical world, and if we don't find a way to make it easier to build, we are going to lose not only people, but I think election after election.
But it's only half land use.
It's only half land use, that's right.
So let's talk about the other half. Maybe we can go to questions in 10 minutes or so. Science and technology do indeed make a strong appearance in this book, and I think part of the tension that's laid out is between a kind of NIH-style approach to funding science, in which, unfortunately, PIs who are applying for grants are buried under paperwork, and we're talking about the pursuit of ideas that are believed to be able to succeed, right? And maybe the NIH-style approach is to be contrasted with a DARPA-style approach, wherein you have a program manager who says, well, actually, we're going to go for a moonshot. We're going to do this thing. We're not going to fund the thing that's easy. We're going to fund the thing that's hard, and maybe we're going to lose some bets, but we're going to probably win some as well. In thinking about this spectrum of funding approaches to something like science, it seems to me that we don't want to pick one or the other. And this is, of course, to jump over the fact that the NIH has indeed funded a lot of great work, and scientists haven't always been drowning under paperwork. And so it would appear that there's a point for us to find somewhere along that spectrum. I'm curious what you imagine that point to be, and if it is indeed a spectrum, if you accept that premise.
Yeah, let me set us up this way. I think that, there's an almost impossibly big question to ask here, which is what makes a good life? Ultimately, we wrote a policy and politics book. Why? Books are such a pain in the ass. Why take all this time to write a book about land use policy and citing law and changes in how Ralph Nader changed legal structures in America? What are you trying to say that's deep and real? This is a book about making the good life possible for as many people as possible. And when I think about where does that come from? Where does human progress come from? Why are the 2020s better than the 1920s or the 1820s or the 1720s? Land use policy was much more liberal in the 1720s. You could just build any shit you wanted. It was super easy. So why is life better now? And I think an enormous, enormous part of that question is medical science. Half of the entire human population died before the age of 17, before the 1700s. Even in the early 1900s, the five most common causes of death were all bacterial infection because penicillin didn't exist. And the most common ways that Americans die today, whether it's cancer, cardiovascular disease, dementia, these are tragedies. But they're also ironic gifts of progress. They're disease of old age because we've found a way to cure bacterial infections and create vaccines for measles and smallpox. The world is better today in so many respects because of medical science. And this is even true more recently. You know, some people aren't persuaded by the whole 300-year story. They're like, yeah, but what has it done for us recently? Think about a universal insurance card, right? In so many ways, the role of demand-side liberalism is how do we get a universal insurance card to the hands of as many people as possible? That's such an important goal. Almost as important as what that card buys. That card doesn't buy penicillin in 1930. That card doesn't buy IV plastic bags in 1960. IV plastic bags, MRI machines, CAT scan machines, all these fixtures of modern hospitals did not exist 60 years ago. The card that you hold is made valuable by science and technology. And so if what you want to do is make people's lives better, I think you should be, as a liberal, as a progressive, absolutely obsessed with the question, how do we solve the biggest remaining scientific problems that make people sick? Whether it's cancer, or Alzheimer's, or childhood illnesses, how do we answer these unanswered problems? There's a lever that we have to pull here, and it's the National Institutes of Health. The NIH is the biomedical crown jewel of the world. It has put its fingerprints on 99% of every medical breakthrough over the last 50 years, and the Trump administration right now is absolutely taking a wrecking ball to it without a care. And that sucks. And yet, liberalism cannot allow itself to be a mere defender of the status quo just because Donald Trump is attacking it. You have to be, institutional renewal is the job of every generation. And we should be obsessed with looking at the agencies that we defend, asking the question, how can they be better and better and better? And the fact is, the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, if you ask most scientists in America and say, here's a glass of whiskey, do you have any problems? They'll be like, yeah, and make it a triple. It's not because the NIH is uniquely bad. It's because the NIH is an 80-year-old bureaucracy. And every 80-year-old bureaucracy acts like an 80-year-old bureaucracy. The NIH tends to fund older scientists rather than younger scientists, even though historically it's been younger scientists who come up with the most paradigm-shifting ideas. It funds conservative ideas and incremental ideas rather than bold, brave, high-risk, high-reward ideas, even though those are the ones that are most likely to push forward science. And most tragically to me, and you referenced this, I think this is one of my favorite statistics from the book, the average scientist in America says that they spend 40% of their time applying for grants or filling out paperwork. So they go to school for 4 years, and then they go to their job after that, and then they go to 7 years of PhD, and then they do their postdoc, and then they become a scientist, and they spend all of this time to spend half of their life filling out paperwork. Imagine if a disease broke out in American academia that created chronic fatigue disorder, such that the typical American scientist had to sleep half the year. We'd say, this is terrible. We're losing half of our scientific work base. We gave them this disease. We gave them this disease with our laws and our regulations. And so I think if we're going to not only defend institutions, but be obsessed with making them better, and if we're going to recognize that medical progress might be the most important headwater of human progress, we should be obsessed with ways of making the NIH better. And my brief answer to the question of how do we make science better is there is no formula for breakthrough science. There cannot be. By definition, there is no formula for discovering the unknown, just as there is no formula for writing a hit song that doesn't exist yet. You have to be experimental. And the culture of the NIH, like most bureaucracies, is not experimental. It is in many cases anti-experimental. So I want to run a ton of experiments. I want to run science on the most famous institution of science. I want them to experiment with giving some scientists grant money for 10, 15 years and saying, you don't have to check a single box, just go away and tell me what you come back with. Sometimes I want what's called a golden ticket, where one person in the peer review sort of bank will say, I love this idea so much, I don't care what the rest of my peers say, I'm awarding you my golden ticket. I want some of the awards for scientists to be gifted by lottery. I want the government doing a lot more prizes where they essentially say the same way they were going to buy out Pfizer or Moderna for billions of dollars no matter what they made, as long as it passed phase 3 clinical trials, guarantees to buy certain technologies for billions of dollars and make it essentially free to the public. I want to run experiments on the process of experimentation itself. And I really do think that this is one of the more important parts of the book, even though it's a little bit wonky and chewy. I get that. Like, people don't wake up in the morning exercised over the fact that R01 grant processes haven't really been randomized over the last 80 years. Like, I get that that's not like a cortisol, juking thought to have. But I think this is really, really important because I think science is so important. I think one of the most important reasons the world is better now than it was 40, 50, 100 years ago is because of the way that science allows us to live longer and healthier lives. And we need to find better, non-RFK Jr. Maha ways of actually turning the NIH into a truly scientific institution that's willing to experiment on itself.
Never actually heard somebody pronounced Maha out loud.
Is it Maha?
Yeah, it's slightly more maniacal, I think. Maybe just a quick question on AI, because it's on everybody's lips and it makes a brief appearance in the book, and then we should turn to the audience, I think. In empowering scientists and indeed in empowering technologists, there's a notion in the text about the population kind of reaping the shared profits of AI, and I'm wondering if you can spend a little bit of time thinking about this idea with us, and in particular, I've heard some fears expressed that to empower technologists and to make an assumption about the sharing of profits of AI is akin to something like the disproven notion of trickle-down economics. How do we avoid an outcome wherein investing in technology in this manner does not serve the public and instead empowers and enriches the already powerful few?
Yeah, so there's a line in the opening vignette of this book, which is like a sci-fi vision of what 2050 could look like if we get everything right, that mentions that people have access to an artificial intelligence tool whose profits are shared. It not only increases productivity in a way that shortens the work week, but also we find a way to share profits. This is a gestural detail in a sci-fi vignette. And I don't have a white paper answer as to exactly how to socialize the profits of OpenAI at this very moment. I think doing so would be not only difficult in 2025 with this current administration, hallucinatory. But let me say this: I think there's honestly ways. This gets a little beyond the scope of the book, but I want to be good faith about answering the question. This gets beyond the scope of the book, but I think there's ways in which geopolitics is actually going to push artificial intelligence much closer to government in a way that makes the nationalization of profits not a socialist fever dream, but rather maybe a natural outcome of history. If we build, we meaning the technologists in America, if OpenAI, Microsoft, Anthropic, et cetera, build tools that have the ability to hack energy grids or break encryption and foil foreign governments or protect American systems from AI attacks from foreign governments, I think it's very possible there's going to come a day in the next few years where the federal government recognizes that we are essentially building a next-generation nuclear bomb. The Manhattan Project was not privatized. The government was not like, hey, Ford, GM, you're good with metal stuff. See if you can build a bomb that can destroy a city. No, it was entirely nationalized, highly secret, fully brought into the government. I don't think OpenAI and Anthropic are ever going to allow their entire companies to be fully brought into the government. That's too fanciful. But it's not fanciful for me to think that these technologies are going to be seen as objectively military technologies that require military oversight and also require government spending and policies to protect state secrets. And there's a world in which the deal that's worked out between the OpenAIs of the world and the government is, in exchange for the state protecting your product and protecting the United States from state secrets being leaked to China, let's say, we're not just going to provide this service for free. You need to do something for us. And there might be a way in which these companies are turned into, or parts of these companies are turned into utilities, and parts of their profit are socialized in exchange for a state service. So I think it's very unlikely that, say, a year from now, everyone's doing like their little Ghiblies, and like those profits are like just, you know, sent to everyone's Venmo. Like that's never gonna happen. But as AI and Washington get closer and closer and closer together, it's not entirely fanciful to me that there would be a way that policy works out for the AI companies that's very different from the way that we treat, say, Ford or GM, where these are just pure private companies that have nothing to do with the state.
Let's turn to the audience. I believe there's a mic to the, yes, stage right here. And maybe while folks are lining up, I'm also collecting questions on the internet through that QR code. So I'll start with one of those questions.
Great, do. And here's what I'm going to say before the entire audience lines up behind the mic to my right. I'm going to answer as many questions as we can before we got to run. But I do want to throw out, like, Ezra and I are going to a lot of different cities. Some of them I live in and know a lot about the local politics of. Some of them I've been to twice, like Seattle, and like know something of the local politics. But we do get questions from time to time that are like, Derek, how would you fix Los Angeles transit? And I'm like, I'm so sorry. I just have no idea where to begin to answer that question other than giving you something that's incredibly rote and sort of basically applied to every single city. So that's just the preamble that I want to throw out there. But please, ask truly whatever question you have.
Not going to ask you how to fix Seattle. I don't think anyone knows the answer to that question. But you mentioned in your podcast episode with Ezra Klein, originally wanting to launch this book right around the Democratic National Convention to drive a conversation around the party's platform. That didn't happen, but I was listening to Gavin Newsom's podcast with Ezra Klein, and he seemed bought in. He said he sent it to two policy people, I don't remember who they were, in California state politics. My question is, how much do you think this is driving the conversation? Have you heard from other leaders like Gavin Newsom, hey, this is really good, let's try to make this happen?
We've heard from an astonishing number of politicians, yeah, at the state level, at the national level, Congress, Senate, other. It's really detonated. And I want to contextualize its detonation humbly by saying we're not the only conversation about the future of the Democratic Party that has exploded. Bernie Sanders and AOC can just show up anywhere and get 30,000 people screaming in front of them, right? There is clearly an enormous demand among Democrats, among the entire left of center, truly from the like slight right of center to the far left of center, to understand where do we go from here. In part because the Democratic Party is bottomed out. It's not clear what it stands for, and it's not clear who stands for it. Who is, if you ask Americans who they're most likely to vote for in the 2028 Democratic primary, I think Kamala Harris is still number one, and it's one of these like tiny pluralities that's almost like damning with faint praise. And even there, you're looking at a little bit of a familiarity vote rather than a strong preference. There's not a clear leader of the party right now. And so there's a lot of people looking for a message. Bernie and AOC have a very clear message. And Bernie, to his extraordinary credit, has had the same message for decades. And that's part of its clarity and part of its power. I think people who are on the center left, who don't consider themselves social democrats or democratic socialists or, or whatever word has the word socialist in it that has various definitions depending on the other words that are there, I'm not even making fun of it. There's just like a lot of different gradations. People who don't consider themselves part of that world, I think, are looking for a message that is critical of the Democratic Party while belonging to it. And I think one thing this book has done in a way that we didn't even necessarily intend is almost like create a permission structure for center-left Democrats to deeply criticize the party while still calling themselves Democratic. And so I think it's performing that role. But humbly, realistically, you just have to acknowledge, like, this book is not the only party in town. Like, Bernie and AOC are lighting the world on fire. Like, New Hampshire representatives are going to town halls and like filling it out like it's a Chaperone concert or something. Like, people are just really, really hungry for an answer to the question, where does liberalism go from here? Or where does the Democratic Party go from here?
Thanks so much for the talk. One thing I was curious about is at the end of the book you talked about political orders, and I'm curious, to what extent do you think political orders are created by elites versus like popular movements? And if popular movements, how do you think that you can like avoid politicization that seems like inevitable of like every political movement that's like gained traction in the last, like, I don't know, at least however long I've been alive?
So I'm going to answer your question while slipping around the concept of political order, because I think explaining it is going to take too long. The question is basically like, how do you create political movements, right? Are political movements a creation of elites or the creation of the people? I think the answer is yes. I think if you take New Deal liberalism seriously or neoliberalism seriously, like Reaganite neoliberalism, there were elites who were building the ideas of New Deal liberalism, like Keynes, or like Milton Friedman in the 1970s, or the Heritage Foundation. There was work that was being done to sort of like lay out an agenda and draw a map of ideas. But fundamentally, people don't vote for economists like Keynes. They don't vote for economists like Friedman, Milton Friedman. They don't vote for books. People don't vote for ideas. People vote for people. People love Bernie Sanders. They vote for Bernie Sanders overwhelmingly. Some of them vote for him for his ideas, but the fact that other people that share his politics haven't been as successful in national politics, I mean, AOC is on the come up, and we'll see how she fares in a primary, but is because people just love Bernie. They love the person. And, you know, Obama was beloved in his time not because people like looked at the white paper that summarized his ideas and were like, I really like his position on the individual mandate, because I thought about, like, some people were into that, but most people were just taken by the person. And so fundamentally, I do think that like people vote for people. And so if you're an author of a book, you don't want to lie to yourself and say people are going to vote for like this book. No, they're not. No one's going to vote for this book. People are going to vote for a person. But my sort of theory of like, I don't know, like influence or something, like how to be a writer who like affects the world, is that when crises happen, when there are moments when people need ideas, they reach for whatever's off the shelf. They reach for whatever ideas around them. And it's the writer's job to stock the shelves with good ideas, so that when the crisis hits, when the moment calls for action, the ideas that are being reached for don't suck. And so what this book hopes to do is yes, it's working through some elite channels, I get that. But it's not because I think that elites are the lever on the world. It's because I think people are the lever on the world. And in 2027 or in 2026, there's going to be questions that need to be answered about how to fix America, and they're just going to be reaching for what's available, and we want to make what's available a good idea.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming here. Really appreciate you.
Thank you.
I guess I've been working in broken bridges for a little while. I was in failing schools, and now I'm a housing lawyer in eviction defense. So my question would be, you talked about those broken bridges that people tolerate. Did you have any examples in writing this book where people stopped tolerating those broken bridges? And what is a way to make people stop tolerating things like homelessness and failing schools?
It's a great question. I appreciate you asking it. I think there's a story to be written about Buffy Wicks and Scott Wiener in California, the 2 California state senators who've been probably most forward on the YIMBY movement in that state. I think that's a story of a small group of people trying to sound the alarm about a broken bridge. And the degree to which they've succeeded, which is still far from clear, is a sign of how hard change can be. You're trying to change an enormous system that by definition has complex networks of incumbent interests that are very difficult to move off their spot, in large part because sometimes they're self-interested for reasons that actually reflect their own self-interest. And so I think theirs is a really good example. I think the YIMBY movement in California is a really lovely example of how hard change can be, how it can sometimes appear at times to move exclusively through elite networks and not trickle down into actual law. And then sometimes with laws like SB 9 and the current legislative agenda that they're pushing now, sometimes how the asteroid can make contact with Earth. You can push and push and push, and finally it happens. But there's no use in lying about how difficult this is. You know, one of our sort of co-conspirators on some of these politics matters, Matt Iglesias, has a new stat called slow boring. I think it was Weber who said that politics is the slow boring of hard boards. It's not easy. It's slow, slow, slow. And that's why this is work that needs not only patience. Patience is a virtue, but more important, it needs a kind of drive, right? It needs a kind of courage. You probably didn't expect a Nietzsche quote at an abundance meeting, but Nietzsche, for all of his horrendous politics, sometimes had a good aphorism, and one of his good aphorisms is, for someone who has a why, they can withstand any how. And I think I love that idea, that like there's something really, really critical about drive, and the people who've been passionate in California about changing housing policy, I think are slowly beginning to really, really affect change in the state.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I was at Capitol Hill Station the other day, and a group of pro-housing advocates tried to lure me in to sign a petition. And so I ended up chatting with them, and they gave me this 6-point manifesto of their entire project, which ranged from more public housing to ending the war in Gaza. And so I was wondering, do you think that liberals have a focus problem when it comes to their issues? And what can we do about it?
Sometimes they say, we take questions, not statements. That was very cleverly a statement wrapped in the form of a question. I mean, well, consider the witness very much led in this case. Look, as Ezra coined this incredibly sticky term, everything big liberalism, to describe the tendency of some progressives to try to make every piece of their agenda a sticking point for every other piece of their agenda. So if you're going to try to pass funding for rural broadband, or pass funding for building semiconductor fabs, or pass funding for high-speed rail, there are so many other progressive priorities that attach like barnacles to the law, that fulfilling every progressive priority makes the law impossible to actually affect in reality. I think it's a really, really clever observation, and it is one of those things where like once you see it somewhere, you see it everywhere. At the same time, you know, I think, look, I really think there's an enormous value in political focus. And I also think political focus is very hard. It's very hard to know what you should really be focused on, even within housing, right? Even if there was no call for justice and geopolitics at the end of that list, even if it was just housing, it still might have been too many things to focus on at once. Like understanding where the levers of progress are is so hard. And that's why parts of this book are, I think, sort of unembarrassed about getting into the weeds of high-speed rail, of how the NIH actually works, to say, what is actually, how does this law actually work? How does this institution actually function? To give people a sense of the texture of government. Because you need to understand how things work in order to truly fix them. Like one frustration that I have with some people I know who are like tech folks in Silicon Valley, where sometimes I see on their side, many times I don't. Their defenses of Doge are, sometimes you just have to turn the system off to turn it back on. It's like, man, government's a $6 trillion machine. It's not your fucking toaster. Like, you want to, with the toaster, it's okay to not know how it works. So you're just like, I guess I'll do that. Like, with government, you actually want to understand what's forwarding American interests at USAID and what's not. I think very much. What's not working at NIH and what is? Those questions aren't being asked. It's destroy first, ask questions later. And so there's a way in which at least I give progressives an enormous amount of credit for asking the questions first and then acting. Sometimes it creates a scenario where, like, the character trait of progressivism is bureaucratic and the character trait of conservatism is autocratic. And you want to find there's like a lot of space in the middle. But I do give liberals that credit. They don't destroy what they don't understand. And that's a part of what makes me want to belong to that movement and fix it rather than run away from it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we've probably got time for about 2 more here, with apologies to folks in line and on the internet. You've got quite the pile on the iPad as well, Derek.
Why don't we? How about this? Why don't let's in the spirit of abundance, let's double it, and why don't 4 of you ask a question, make it relatively quick, and I'll just answer the ones that I want to answer.
All right, let's hear some questions.
Okay, I'll make it quick then. You speak to some rules in the book, or how we can change some rules to increase government funding riskier science. I was wondering if you could speak to the political side of this, because it seems like there's still the golden fleece problem of lawmakers who vote to increase funding for some riskier science are voting against their own short-term self-interest because they're going to be up for re-election before the high-risk, high-reward stuff pays off.
Yeah, you make the case that weird science is good science. What's the most famous drug of the last 5 years? Ozempic. Where'd it come from? Lizard spit. Sometimes it pays to look inside the mouth of a Gila monster if you want to fix obesity. It doesn't make sense, but that's how science works. I'm trying to go fast. Yeah,
So I promise this is a question from slightly left of center, but I want to come back to that beginning part where you talk about shared profit. And at the beginning, I thought, hot damn, there's going to be talk about income maldistribution. And the point I'm trying to make is that merely sharing profits from AI won't address the broken system of income maldistribution. I really appreciate that you talk to human abundance, personal abundance, as opposed to, pecuniary abundance and materialism. But still, people have to have a paycheck to pay for the housing and the health care, what have you. And I'm wondering if they wrote a chapter on income maldistribution, that broken system, what would the chapter say?
We believe in a really robust welfare state, in Medicare, in expanding Medicaid, in expanding the earned income tax credit, in doubling the child tax credit. At least I'll speak personally. I support all those things. This should be real macroeconomically. America's in a high interest rate environment with an enormous amount of debt, and there's an enormous political constituency to cut everything in welfare. If you want to grow out of it, you have to grow out of it. You need a pro-growth policy in order to afford a redistributional agenda in America. And so rather than see supply-side growth and demand-side, so to speak, welfare as being like 2 different doors you can walk through, I very much see them as one door you have to walk through. You have to have growth if you're going to support an expensive welfare state, which I support. I don't see any path toward making Medicaid and Medicare and all those policies. I don't see a path toward allowing them to be grown in order to fix income inequality without enormous GDP growth. And so that's why we're so fixated on it.
Gotcha.
I'm going to reference your point about carrying capacity. I just don't think we can electrify the grid and transition to renewables, diverting them from degrowth principles like you were talking about, because the renewable technology you're talking about still relies on rare earth minerals that need to be extracted, and it still relies on intensive extractivist industries that reinforce imperial hegemonies at a global level. So we just don't see the most harmful effects in the U.S. How would you address this issue? That was kind of one of the major problems of the Green New Deal, that it ignored the major conflicts sparked, for instance, by cobalt and lithium extraction in the DRC and Zimbabwe. So how would you address that?
Trade-offs, trade-offs, trade-offs. There is no world that doesn't have a trade-off that can be framed catastrophically. If we continue along the current environmental path, we burn the planet. If we stop growth entirely and ask people to accept lower living standards and to turn off their electricity a little bit more and allow energy prices to grow, progressivism loses catastrophically maybe for a generation and loses its power to not only direct energy policy but also to direct redistributional policy. If you pursue a clean energy policy that requires abundant lithium, it absolutely that will, or not just lithium, but cobalt, which I think is probably most problematic in terms of its African politics, that will also entail dirty politics that require mining cobalt in places in Africa. There's no utopian door that we just haven't thought of yet, right? Every door incurs trade-offs. This book is my favorite set of trade-offs. Other people are going to have their own favorite set of trade-offs. Everything else is just persuasion. So I hope I'm persuasive that my set of trade-offs are the best ones, but it doesn't even matter if I'm wrong. I might not be persuasive, and some other vision might win. My worry is that if this vision loses, the vision that will win instead is not a greener Green New Deal. It'll just be more oil. So that's why I like these trade-offs.
Thank you.
Last question in the lightning round.
My apologies for being the last question and being kind of a silly one. I'm already in the bag for abundance, and I know you like basketball. So the Elam ending for the NBA, are you for it?
The what?
The Elam ending.
What is that?
Oh my God. Okay, so I'll explain very quickly. So a basketball game goes down to 2 minutes. The numbers can vary. You add 7 minutes on, clock turns off. First to that score, say the score is like 100 to 90, first to 107. You don't have the hack-a-shack at the end. You're actually playing real basketball.
Yeah, I'm working through it right now for the first time. I think the name's gonna need some branding.
It's named after a middle
right?
math teacher who came up with it. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Unrivaled did it. NBA All-Star Game tried it.
I think
it's the best.
All right, just to close with my thoughts on basketball, I think the problem with basketball is that 20 teams make the playoffs if you include the play-in, and the playoffs take about 3.5 months. Football is a game with 30 teams that takes 4 months. So the NBA playoffs is basically like 75% of the entire football regular season. So you don't even have to pay attention to the regular season of the NBA to still be like, I'm going to pay attention to this in like late April, early May, and you're still in for like a full season of sport. So the NBA has just like worked itself into a position where it's much more interesting to talk about trade machines for the entire regular season than it is to actually watch a product that doesn't actually matter because all these teams are making the playoff anyway. Then you can work on the thing.
Look it up. You'll like it. You'll like it.
Okay, I know I said that was the last one, but I absolutely must throw a bone to the digital audience who's been very patient here, and I'm just going to take this top-ranked question. Is there merit to the arguments that the inability to build or develop is not a unique challenge to the U.S., and instead we're talking about a challenge that's endemic to places like Canada or Britain or the European Union? We see anti-democratic states, for example, authoritarian regimes, delivering services, delivering built projects very quickly. Let me try to wrap this question up.
So what's up with that?
What is up with that? I think we should end on a what is up with that.
Yeah, well, what's up with that? It's a good question.
Can authoritarian regimes deliver services better, Derek?
Authoritarian regimes are very good at building whatever they want to build. Whether that's what the people want to build is just a question that's never asked. And sometimes the answer is going to be yes, and often the answer is going to be Stalin's 5-year plan. I think that it's important that South Korea builds nuclear power plants 4 times cheaper than the US or the UK. Madrid and Portugal build trains and transit, by some measures, up to 8 times cheaper than the US. There is no law that says that a country that gets rich has to have exactly the problems that the United States has. It might be the case that as you get richer, it naturally becomes more difficult to amend the physical world as more people attain legal power in order to stop the government from changing it. But there's a lot of space between, say, China over here and Madrid here and the US and the UK over here. The fact that the first 3 countries that you mentioned or the questioner mentioned were the UK, Canada, and the US also raises, I think, the very interesting question of what's the deal with Anglophonic countries not being able to build shit. There seems to be something about the relationship between a certain kind of former British Empire individualism matched with like a relationship to the environment that makes it hard for the physical world to be altered around rich people in countries that Queen Victoria or like George III or II happened to like rule over 300 to 400 years ago. I don't know why exactly that's the case, but the fact that they're all English speaking, I think, is notable.
Okay, Derek Thompson, you can ask him about the Commonwealth. You can ask him about basketball. He's at the Atlantic, and he wrote a book with Ezra Klein called Abundance.
Yeah, I want to thank both Derek and Clayton for speaking with us tonight. Now, anyone who would like their book Abundance signed by Derek, there are still copies of the book here in the Auto Bar, Third Place Books, and he will sign them if you proceed behind the screen and enter the stage. He will sign the book for you. Thank you.